Hey folks, so last time in part 1 of CNC from scratch, I made some lines on a bit of MDF and showed you the kind of cuts you can make with a CNC machine. This time we're going to take a look at how you can make your own lines in Carbide Create. Now don't worry, even if you use another program to design in like Inkscape or Illustrator or Infinity Designer, most of the concepts we're going to cover will transfer to any kind of vector design program. However, before we get started making lines and shapes, we need to talk a little bit about setup. Carl Sagan once said that if you truly want to create an apple pie from scratch, you must first build the universe. Fortunately for us, we're not making apple pie, and we're not really starting that completely from scratch. However, if we're going to design for CNC, we do kind of need to create our material, or at least describe it to Carbide Create. So there are a ton of different materials we can cut with CNC. Wood, acrylic, aluminum, even chocolate. And while it's important to know what material you're cutting, what we really need right now is to tell the machine the size of what we are cutting. Starting with a new file in Carbide Create, you can click the gear icon in the upper left corner to get to the Job Setup window. The Job Setup is where we'll describe our stock size to Carbide Create. The first two parts are fairly self-explanatory. We just need to give it a height and a width of what we're trying to cut. So in this case, we've got 33 inches by 24 inches. I'm going to go ahead and take that down to something a little bit more reasonable, 10 by 8. Something a little smaller. And those are pretty self-explanatory. The next thing we need to add is thickness. In this case, I want something a little bit more accurate than what I've got up here. I usually take these measurements with a tape measure, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But thickness, I want it to be a little more accurate because I don't want to run my bit down into my spoil board if I can avoid it. This will also help you make some very accurate cuts when you're doing things like pockets. So I'll do the thickness calculation with a set of dial calipers, which I highly recommend getting. These will give you an accurate thickness to 1/100 of an inch, and they definitely come in handy for this. Now the other thing that's interesting about this is you'll notice we've got this zero height. Zero is an interesting thing that we'll get into much later on. Zero is basically where we're going to tell the machine we're starting that measurement from. Now in this case we've got two options. We can start from the top and measure down, or from the bottom and measure up. This will make a little bit more sense once we get into the setup for the machine itself, but for right now I'm going to leave this on the top, and that's where we're going to tell the machine zero will start. So our 0.5 measurement is 0.5 inches from where we start down to the bottom. So toolpath 0 is our next piece, and what this tells us is when we start out, where are we starting on our stock for our measurements. Up here we've got a width and a height, 10 inches, 8 inches. So if our width is going across here, the machine knows it starts here, and then it can count 10 inches over and 8 inches up. If we start in some of these other sections, say center left, the machine knows that it's going to count 4 inches up, 4 inches down, so that it knows in each case where our stock is positioned relative to this zero starting point. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave this right now lower left, but the other positions can come in handy for different things. But for right now, we're going to tell the machine that's where we want to start. The next piece is our material, and in this case I'm going to be cutting MDF, so I'm going to leave this here, but you can use any of the settings here. If you come across something like, say, plywood, which isn't listed here, I just go with the next thing, which is hardwood, and you can work backwards from there. So then you need to tell it what machine you're using. In my case, I'm using an XXL. and we need to have a retract height. What the retract height does is it says anytime I'm going to make a really fast motion across the machine, that's how far up I want that bit to go. We want to make sure that this clears our stock completely, otherwise it's going to drag a great big line across what we're doing, and we don't want that. The last thing we come to is our units. We can choose inches or millimeters. I have personally been ruined by the U.S. educational system, so I'm going to use inches, and we'll let it go from there. Our setup section also has two other pieces we need to take a quick look at. The first one is this, the set grid. This will let you set your grid spacing for something appropriate to your project, and since by default things snap to this grid, it does make it a lot easier when you're trying to measure things out. I typically set this to about 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch, depending, and you can also turn it off if you want. If you've got your file set to millimeters, this will be in millimeters, and your grid spacing will be in millimeters as well. The other thing you've got here, this is a background, and what this is for tracing things. So if I want to load a background image, I'm going to load a logo here. Alright, and this is loaded an Apple logo. I'm going to scale it down about 25%. Yeah, that works. And I can grab it and move it up onto my canvas wherever I want. And this opacity here kind of fades it into the background. I could set this to 1 and I would get it to be as, bright as it's going to get. But usually, about 50-25% is fine. So 0.5 is what I'm going to set this for. And what that lets us do is use our tools to try and trace this shape. It just gives us a nice stencil we can use here. You can also come back in here and turn it on and off, just so if you want to compare what your shapes look like versus what the background logo here looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off for right now, as we don't really need it, and we'll come back to it later. So as I've mentioned in a few of my videos, CNC machines use what's called vector graphics to guide the cuts. At its most basic, a vector is a series of nodes with lines or curves between the nodes. From a practical side, this means that vectors are made up of math, and computers are very good at following math. From a visual standpoint, a square is a vector shape with 4 nodes, one at each corner. The information stored in the vector tells the machine to start at one node, move in a straight line to the next, to the next, to the next, until it comes back around to the start. While the square is obviously a very simple shape, vectors can be used to create very complex drawings with a high degree of accuracy. Since everything behind the vector is just math, it can also be scaled up or down without any loss of detail. This makes them particularly handy for CNC. In this section, we'll start with the very simple shapes for vectors and some of the tricks with using them. We'll then talk a little bit about text and fonts, and we'll also get down to the fine details of editing individual nodes in a shape. Okay, now let's take a look at creating our vectors. I'm going to start with the circle, square, and the polygon, your basic simple shapes. To draw these, click one, get a center point, click in the center point, and then drag out and click again. Don't get too precious about what size they are initially or where they are in the document, because you can move them around wherever you want, and then you can come over here and adjust your sizes. The one thing to remember with this is its radius. It's not diameter, so it's half your circle. I've done this a couple of times where I thought, okay, 0.25, I'm creating a 1/4 of an inch circle. Nope, you're not. You're creating a 1/2 inch circle. And that will make you unhappy. But again, like I said, you can adjust your sizes and make them whatever size you want and move them wherever you want. So just get kind of approximate when you're creating these shapes. Same goes for squares. Let's create a square or a rectangle. In this case, I've got a 2x2 square. I can actually set height and width on these, so I can create rectangles or whatever I want. I can also set a radius on the corners here. So, for example, this one right now has sharp corners. I can set these to be a fillet, which is a rounded corner. And then it rounds those corners nicely like that. I can also set it for a chamfer, which is a flattened corner, like this. Flipped fillet, which is an inner rounded corner, like these. A dog bone, which gives us kind of a lump over here at the top from either side. And then the T, which is kind of unique in that it gives you this flat side here and makes our rounds only at the top. So that just gives you some ideas of some things you can make to control the edges of these squares. And some of them are more useful than others. I tend to use the fillet more than anything else, and that's just when I'm trying to get two pieces to fit together. I know that I need to have a slight round to my inner and outer cuts like we found out in the last piece. So those will help you create those inner and outer cuts. Now again, this is a radius, which means right now what I've got is essentially a 1/2 inch kind of radius. And I can see by taking my 1/2 inch circle and dragging it up there, I can kind of get a feel for, okay, yeah, that looks like, that will fit inside there. And I sometimes use this occasionally. I'll set this circle to be my bit size, which if I was doing a 1/4 inch bit, remember I'm radius, so 125, and that would then be my 1/4 inch bit, and I could definitely see that, yeah, that would work out just fine. It could get to all of those spaces. Now, the last one we have is a polygon here, and it's the same kind of thing. You can drag this out, click a center, expand it to whatever size you need, move it around. You can also set the number of sides that you want. So this will also create triangles. You can create squares again if you need to. And any other polyhedral shape, octagon, whatever you want. So that's polygons. You can also set a radius for those. Like I said, remember it's half. It's not the diameter, so it's not the whole. But again, that gives you a number of shapes you can start to work with. Text. If you click the T here, you'll get a little block that says text, right? And I can move this around wherever I want it to. And I've got a font menu here that'll let me select any fonts. I can type new text here. And I can set the height of that text. One thing I want to point out about text is there's an issue with Carbide's font menu. I've seen a lot of people posting that they load text into their system, but they can't make it show up in the menu. The menu is a little odd. If I scroll up, you'll notice we're alphabetical, and I continue scrolling down. We get all the way to our last ones, and then it starts over again. And you get a second set of fonts in alphabetical order. And then it starts over again, and you get a third set of fonts in alphabetical order. And these may be entirely different sets. I'm not quite sure how Carbide is organizing this menu, but if you can't immediately see a font in there, it may be that it's in somewhere else in the list. You'll have several alphabetical order sub-lists essentially inside of this menu. So you may need to search a little bit in your fonts to find that one that you downloaded. And you'll need to hit apply in order to get any of those text changes to apply themselves. Once you're finished editing your text here, you can just click done, and you can always come back and reselect it, hit text, and then make some adjustments if you need to there. Our polyline vector which lets us draw straight lines. And then connect them at the end like this. So I get a nice enclosed shape like that. I can also create shapes that aren't enclosed by coming over here, selecting polyline, and just doing a drawing like this that isn't closed. And then when I click over here on done, my drawing remains open and an open set of lines like this. Now you'll notice when I click away from it, this one is pink. And this is Carbide Create's way of telling me the only thing I'm going to be able to do with this is trace it. Because if I'm trying to cut inside or outside, it doesn't know what inside or outside of this is. There is no enclosed shape, so therefore there is no inner or outer. So again, this is just Carbide's way of telling me this is an open vector. You can trace it, but you can't do a whole lot else with it. Now, our other version of this is the curves tool. What this lets you do is the same kind of thing, except for you can click and then click and drag, okay? And that lets you create curves. And again, this is not something I am very good at drawing with at all, but Bezier curves are definitely something artists are used to using, and more power to them. But you create them like this, and in the same way that we did an open like that, we can do the same thing with our curves tool. Click, click, drag, and then come over here and hit done. And we've got our open vector here. So these are kind of interesting in that they lead to a slightly different way. If you want to come back and edit one of these, right? Say we're going to edit this, we want to close him up. I come over here and I'm going to select the node tool. And this is where things get really, really interesting. So nodes, you notice, are these little squares here and these little circles here. And I can take a node and grab it and drag it over, and now that's an enclosed shape. So the other thing that I can do is, you'll notice up here we've got two shortcuts. S is for smooth the selected nodes. That means I can grab a node here, click on it, hit S, and you'll notice I get these two tiny handles. And I can do like we did with the curves and make different kinds of things with this node. So the other thing we can do with nodes is we can delete them. Now this is a little bit annoying. Normally you would think you can click a node and then hit the delete key. Unfortunately, that deletes the whole shape, so you don't really want to do that. What you want to do is come up here, you see where it says shortcuts, hit D to delete that node, and now we've deleted that node and it's gone. But again, you can move these however you want, change your shape around, and do all kinds of wonderful things with the node editor. You can also right click on the line and insert a new node, and then use that to drag it around. And again, you can smooth those, you can change the shape, you can do all kinds of things. Now let me exit out of here for a second, because one of the other interesting things with this is these are exactly the same as this. They're all nodes and they're all lines, which means I can come in here and click this. I can click the node editor and bang, I've got all these little nodes, which means I can drag this up and create a different shape. I can delete any of these nodes. I can create curves for these nodes. Hit my little S key and now I've got this kind of shape. So that gives you a lot of options with editing. The other thing you'll notice is that when I click my open objects here, right, there's an extra little bit here that basically says connect the two closest nodes. And if I click that, it closes those up. Next up, we have our transform tools. These allow us to move, scale, rotate, and align our shapes. They also allow us to create offset paths, which draw a new shape around the outside or inside of the shape we have selected. I use this one a lot when making boxes. Together, these tools can be combined with the grid to give you a great deal of control over the layout of your designs. The transform tools only appear when one or more items are selected, and some of them have specialized features that are worth knowing. Let's take a look. I'm going to start by creating some text here. Okay, done. So now when I have this selected, you'll notice I have these transform tools over here. These do some pretty basic things, but they're really powerful used in conjunction with each other. So let's start with this one, the move tool. Now, normally you can just drag things around, and if you select the center or the corners of this, you can drag it around like you're used to, right? However, this is kind of interesting. If I grab either the top one or bottom one, no matter how far my cursor gets off the center, I can only move this up and down. Same if I grab left and right, I can only move left and right even if my cursor is way off of that line. This is great for when you're actually trying to align certain parts and keep things on a particular level. So that can be a very helpful way to move things when you don't want to do it just the regular way of just grabbing it and dragging it around. The next tool is this one, which is the scale tool. The scale tool lets you change your size. You can do just grab, drag, that kind of thing. You can also stretch things like text, so that's kind of cool. There's also, you'll notice down here, a scale factor, and that can come in particularly handy when you're trying to resize someone else's designs. As I've said before, this is the big advantage with vector graphics. You can scale them up, scale them down, and there's no loss of fidelity. This makes it a lot easier to use other people's designs in your project and make sure they'll fit things for your stock. So the next tool we have is rotate. Rotate gives you exactly what you'd expect. You can grab these, drag them, okay, and you can do it by a particular angle. That's nice. The other thing that you can do with this that's helpful is you can take this rotational center and grab it and drag it around, and then every change you make is based on this particular center. So if I change this to 35, you notice it rotated around where that center was. So those are helpful. These next two are mirroring for horizontal and vertical. Horizontal is great if you're building molds or something like that and you need to reverse texts. They come in very handy. This one will flip things for the vertical, and that can be useful in some situations as well. The other things we have here are the offset vectors. Now, what offset vectors allow you to do is draw lines around or inside the text or inside the shape. So if I set this to outside and give it a distance of 0.1 inches, I get this. So this would be helpful if I'm doing things like I want to V-carve these letters and then I want to cut out the general shape of the letters. So that's handy for that. You can also do a pass inside as well. So I'm going to switch this to inside and set that to 0.3 inches. And now you'll notice I've got an extra set of lines in here as well. So this will line the inside of any shape. It's actually one of the tools I really use the most when I make boxes, simply because I can create an outer shape for a box, then decide how thick I want the walls to be, Say I want them to be 1/4 of an inch like this, I can do 1/4 of an inch offset inside, and bang, I've got the basics for my box right here. Like I said, inset and outset are very, very helpful tools to use. Another really helpful tool is alignment. One of the things you'll notice in Carbide Create is that when you go to create things in text, you only have a single line of text here that you can create. You can't create multi-line text. However, one of the nice things is you can align these things. Now, you can align them by hand, and that might work, but your best bet is actually, let's go ahead and select these guys, and I'm going to go ahead and align them to this. And I can align them to the center, or I can align them to the edge. And that way I can keep things where I want them. This also comes in handy when you're trying to fit things in the center of stuff. I use it a lot for, say, if I'm adding an ornamental piece to a box and I need it to be centered in the middle of this, I can then select this, and you'll notice that there's a dashed line. This tells me I'm going to be centering this piece to this piece, not vice versa. The dashed line is what I'm centering to. And I can just say, boom, align my centers, and done. So the rest of the centering pieces also come in handy when you're doing smaller things like notches. So if I had a shape that I wanted notches in, let's say I've got some 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch notches that I want to put in. All right, and I want to put those in the center of this. I can come in here, and this is one thing that drives me a little bit nuts. I can do one, and then I have to do this again, and that aligns here. I kind of wish they would leave this open, but they don't. The other thing that you can do that's really good with this is if you've got something that needs to be right in the center of your stock. Let's say we wanted this world in the center of the stock. I can come in here, and since I only have one thing selected, I'm not aligning to anything else in here. I can choose align to stock. Have to actually click one, and bang, that aligns to the dead center of the stock. That's helpful when making sure that you're not going to get too close to the edge with things. Now, once you have things aligned where you want them, you might sometimes need to move them around the canvas. And if you just grab one of these guys and move, you're only moving the one thing, so you don't want that. You can just grab them all and move them, but what's easier to do if you might need to move something around is to select all of them like this and choose this little icon right here. This is the group vectors. This makes one entire set out of this, and now I can, anytime I grab it, I'm grabbing all of it. This is also helpful when you're selecting tool paths because it means you can select all of this and then set tool paths for everything at once. So that can be helpful as well. If you need to break things apart, you come back over, you notice you've got the little X here on it, and that will break things apart into individual shapes, and you can now move those individual shapes again. The transform tools are very, very helpful in keeping things where you want them on the stock and making sure that all of your pieces are aligned where they need to be. The next thing we need to cover is Boolean Operations. These can be a little bit confusing at first, but they're also the most rewarding in terms of getting complex designs into Carbide Create. Boolean operations take you beyond the limitation of simple shapes by allowing you to combine these shapes in a number of interesting ways. You can add shapes together, subtract one shape from another, or create a new shape from the place where these two shapes overlap. If you can master Boolean operations, your designs will really begin to take off. So the first thing to note about the Boolean options is they only appear when you've got more than one thing selected. So if I have both of these selected, you'll notice I get my Boolean options here. And there are three of them. There's a union, there's an intersection, and there's a subtraction. Now let's try the Boolean union first. One of the things I like to do on these is to make sure that I'm on the grid with these. It makes it easier when I'm aligning things for Boolean operations. So in this case, I'm going to select my circle, and I'm going to grab it by the center so that I can move it over right over that square like that. Now I want to select both of them, and I'm going to choose union. And that gives me this kind of shape. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this one, only we're going to do subtraction. Move it here. And then I'm going to choose subtraction. Now you notice that the dashed line is on my circle. That tells me what it's going to do is it's going to subtract my circle from my square. Now it's subtracted it. It also left me with my circle. This is something fairly recent that Carbide Create has started doing. And it's good for if you need to subtract multiple things. But if I now move that circle out of the way, you'll see it has indeed subtracted it from the square. Now the intersection is one that I don't use very much. The one place I have found that it is very useful for is to get kind of a pie slice shape with these. So if I grab my circle, my center, and I stack it to that node, then I select both, and again you see my dotted line is on my circle. That intersection just gives me this piece now. And that can be useful for a lot of things. And again, this lets you do a lot of more complex shapes that you wouldn't normally be able to do with just the regular drawing tools. And the last thing to note with our Boolean shapes is that, again, once we're done, these are all nodes. I can now zoom in and edit any of these nodes in this circle or in this square part. And any of these are the same way. Select one, click the node editor, and now I have all these points that I can edit and move around. This lets you hone in on your shapes and get things exactly where you want them to be. The last thing we're going to cover is the import and trace tools, along with a couple of the menu options in Carbide Create. Many of you may be like me and not really practiced at drawing your own designs. The import and trace functions allow you to take designs from an outside source and use them in your projects. As I've noted in the past, you should never steal other people's work. You can find open source designs at places like the Noun Project or Wikimedia, or you can pay a reasonable fee to license a vector design from places like Etsy or Shutterstock. Always take the time to support creative people. It just makes the world less crummy. Okay, the import portion of this is pretty straightforward. Again, we're looking for SVG or DXF files. I've got some on my drive. I'm going to go ahead and pull one of those in. I just click the import button, and I'm going to grab this. I'm sure most of you have seen some variation of this file. It seems to sort of be a rite of passage. Now you notice it's put it in here fairly small, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to group it to make sure I get everybody, and then scale, and I'm going to drag it up so that it's big enough to fill my canvas. You can see there's a lot of nice little detail in that one. Now again, with something like this, you're going to want to make sure that there are no open vectors, which would be pink lines that you'll see here. You can also go ahead and see if there are any of these shapes that you want to improve on or modify, because again, these are all nodes and lines again. With something like this, you're better off zooming in, and this is something I've kind of glossed over a little bit, but your scroll wheel will zoom in and out. You can also come in under your view window and choose Reset View, and that will zoom you back out to the normal size of your canvas. One other thing that's really helpful with this is I zoom in a lot, and then I decide I need to look at someplace else on the canvas. On the Mac, if you hold the Control key, I assume it's something similar on Windows, I can click and drag this, and that will let me move around the design rather than just zooming in and out. But I can come in here and go in as far as I want, grab these. I'll need to ungroup this. So say if I just wanted to edit this, I can grab that, and again, there's all its nodes, and I can move things around or delete them if I want. And I can get rid of any of the small shapes that I don't need here. So once you import your file and do cleanup, then you can go ahead and set things up for your carving. So the trace function does something a little bit differently. You've heard me say a number of times that what we want for carving is vector images. But what the trace function lets us do is take a bitmap image and turn it into a vector image. And for example, right here, I've got a bitmap image. And if I zoom in on it, you'll see, you notice you get the blocky little stuff as you zoom in. That tells you this is a bitmap image. But I can actually take this image, and using the trace function, I can import it into Carbide Create. So choose trace image. I'm going to grab this same PNG file. And you notice I've got a black and white representation. That tells me where it's seeing the contrast between things. I can adjust my threshold, my angle, and all this kind of stuff to try and get better traces. But right now I'm just going to choose trace image. You notice now I've got some red lines here. That showed me where it's going to trace and where it's going to put vector images. I'm going to tell it OK. And you see now I have a vector image that I can shrink, I can expand, and it won't lose any fidelity. The other thing I can do is, like I said, with anything else, let's ungroup these. If I decide these stars aren't quite right, I can just select one of those, go into my edit, drag my nodes around, and fix anything in there that I don't like. Again, it's just a nice vector graphic now that we're done. One thing to note on this, let me delete this guy here, is that these images are traced by contrast. So for example, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to choose this apple PNG. Now you notice this has got the little rainbow fruit, which we've all grown to know and love. And if I click open on this, you'll see part of it just disappears. And that's because it's not high enough contrast for it to actually recognize that. So this wouldn't be a particularly good image to try and do a trace on. You would get the letters here correctly, but you wouldn't get the nice piece of fruit. So something like this is going to be great for high contrast images, but not particularly good at photographs. You'll have to do a lot of work with those to get them right in for something like image tracing. One last thing I wanted to touch on today in this video is a fairly new feature. At least it's new to me. I was today years old when I figured out this actually existed. And that's called layers. Now what layers allow you to do is to stack these things up and turn layers on and off like you would in other vector programs. So if I come here under edit, I've got an option to show layers. And you notice I've got one already. Color's black and it's unlocked, visible, and it's the default. So I'm going to add a new one. And I'm going to call this mermaid. Alright, and that one's red. I can click on this and change the color to whatever I want. Let's make her green, just for fun. And I'm going to click OK. Then I'm going to just select my mermaid. Alright, so now that I've got her selected, come back over, show layers, and then I can click here and say move selection to layer. Now that is a completely separate layer. And I tell it OK. And you notice she is now green. That means she's on a separate layer from the rest of this. And that can be handy in a lot of cases when you're drawing stuff and you've got lots of lines all over the place, because you can come in here with a layer and say turn this one off, so hide it, and that goes away. Show it, you can lock it and make sure that that one doesn't move anywhere. You can also change, like I said, the colors of it. And it's a really good thing to help you keep track of what elements of your design you're working with at any given time. So that's actually a pretty neat, cool feature. I'm glad they added it, and I'll be looking forward to trying to use it some more in my next projects. I hope this has provided some insights on drawing designs with Carbide Create. I know this video has been a bit on the long side even for me, but I didn't want to skip things when it comes to drawing designs. I will probably do a few quicker project videos after this, before coming back to finish up this series with a video devoted entirely to setting toolpaths and another to using Carbide Motion to actually set up, start, and manage your jobs. And yes, one of those project videos will be describing the drawing techniques used in the chapters for this section, including options for pin holding on the CNC. Stay tuned, and hopefully I will see you again soon.